second. Over to you.
God calls to Moses from the tent of meeting and communicates to him the laws of the korbanot, the animal and meal offerings brought in the sanctuary. These include the ascending offering, olah, that is wholly raised to God by the fire atop the altar, 5 varieties of meal offering, mincha, prepared with fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense, the peace offering, shelamim, whose meat was eaten by the one bringing the offering after parts are burned on the altar and parts are given to the Kohanim priests, the different types of sin offering, shatat or chatat, brought to atone for transgressions committed erroneously by the high priest, the entire community, the king, or the ordinary Jew, brought by one who has misappropriated property of the sanctuary, who is in doubt as to whether he transgressed a divine prohibition, or who has committed a betrayal against God by swearing falsely to defraud a fellow man.
That's it. Oh, something's just gone wrong. Sorry. Right. Okay. So that's this week's Sedra. Okay. Starts with the whole idea of the korbanot, which is what we're going to be looking at. 1 second. Just trying to close some things here so it runs a bit better. Okay. So korbanot, sacrifices, central to religious life. Something that people struggle with. It's the whole book of Vayikra. Now, of course, we haven't had sacrifices for about 2,000 years. There's an essay at the back of the Green Singers, which I still haven't read, although I think I should, called Some Thoughts on Animal Sacrifices by Rabbi Sachs. There are those who say that we won't have sacrifices in the times of Mashiach. There are those who say, of course, we will. How can we not? So much of the Torah deals with it. There's much discussion on it. However, let's look at the sort of, without looking at the blood and the gore. I mean, if you're not a meat eater, then fine. If you are a meat eater, it's all very unpleasant, really. Shechita and whatnot, none of it's nice. So leaving aside the blood and gut aspect, but let's look at the kind of the psychological and sort of spiritual ideas of the korbanot. So let's start with good old Samuel Shmuel. Who would like to read number 1?
I'll do it, Rabbi, then.
Go for it, Mark.
Right. Samuel said, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obedience to the Lord's command? Surely obedience is better than sacrifice, compliance than the fat of rams.
Doesn't that sound like the sort of things one might say nowadays? Well, God wants your sacrifices, is killing animals and burning them. Surely he just wants you to follow his mitzvot. Surely that is more important than the sacrifices. That sounds pretty modern. That was in the time of Samuel, right? Temple times. Interesting. Oh, pre-temple times, sorry, but definitely sacrificial times. Let's see what Amos says. Who would like to read next?
I'll read if you like.
Please.
I spurn your festivals. I am not appeased by your solemn assemblies. If you offer me burnt offerings or your meal offerings, I will not accept them. I will not pay heed to your gifts of fatlings. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream.
Okay, and we've got one more here from Hosea. Who'd like to read that?
Okay. For I desire goodness, not sacrifice, obedience to God, rather than burnt offerings.
Goodness me, very critical, not just of the sacrifices. He says, I don't want your gatherings, where you gather and you think you're serving me. What I want is justice and righteousness. I'm not sure this is a helpful discussion, but there were definitely people at the beginning with the closing of minyanim and shuls that said maybe this is a sign from God that he doesn't like our minyanim. Maybe we're not davening properly. Maybe there's too much talking. Maybe we're rushing too much. Maybe we don't have enough respect for our shuls. You know, I don't know if it's too healthy to think about that too much, but definitely a bit of introspection. You can understand why someone might say that. You know, when we, why do you have to fast when you drop a Sefer Torah? At the end of the day, it's an accident. No one would do it on purpose. So why do you have to fast? Any thoughts?
Well, it's
It doesn't matter if it was an accident or not. It still had been dropped.
Right. As
And
I
even
would.
if it was an accident, it shows lack of care
Right.
and respect
Right.
for the.
So as I always used to say when I show school children around the shul, and I would explain that if we drop a scroll, we have to fast. I said, you don't drop a baby, right? Something precious. For anyone who's ever fallen asleep with a baby on them in a chair, you don't drop the baby. It's precious to you. Okay. And obviously, God forbid you should drop a baby. And if you did, I'm sure it'd be an accident. But you don't do it. You don't drop a mean vase. So you don't drop a Sefer Torah. Of course, it's an accident if you drop it. An accident comes from lack of care. Not always, but that's the assumption. So the implicit assumption is that if we drop a Sefer Torah, it means that it may be an accident, of course. It's not deliberate. But still, it shows a lack of care and a lack of respect. So everything, but there's another dimension as well, which is why would if everything is hashgacha pratis and bashet, why would God allow a Sefer Torah to fall, which is so disrespectful? So often when a Sefer Torah has been dropped in a shul, the rabbi will get up and say to people, this is a sign we need to give more respect to the Torah. Clearly we're not giving it enough respect, and as a result it's been shamed in this way, or it's jumped out of the ark to draw attention to itself because we're not paying enough attention to it. So I don't know, maybe, you know, I'm not saying the closing of our shuls is a wake-up call, and I don't think for our community that's a healthy message. But I definitely heard that message in some places, saying, you know, there's a message here that, you know, maybe our shuls aren't the be-all and end-all. It's what we're seeing here. They're saying your sacrifices, you know, they're nothing. I don't want them. What do you mean you don't want them? You commanded us to bring them, God. So clearly, he's not saying I don't want sacrifices because I'm going vegan, because at the end of the day, he gave us lots of mitzvot in the Torah about sacrifices. He's saying, I don't like the way you're doing it. I don't like the intent. You're missing the point. Even the times of the temple and the Mishkan. Okay, we find the same thing from King David here. Who'd like to read? Pam or Julian, would like to read that? Psalm 50.
Mhm. Okay. I censure you not for your sacrifices and your burnt offerings made to me daily. I claim no bull from your estate, no he-goats from your pens. For mine is every animal of the forest, the beasts on 1,000 mountains. I know every bird of the mountains. The creatures of the field are subject to me. Were I hungry, I would not tell you, for mine is the world and all it holds. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of the he-goats? Sacrifice a thank offering to God and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in time of trouble. I will rescue you, and you shall honor me.
Again, it sounds like something
Not sure
someone
what
could
that
say.
means.
Same here,
Okay.
Brenda.
Okay, well, let me summarize my understanding of it. God says, you think I need animals? You think you need to feed me with bulls? And if I'm hungry, I'm not going to tell you. The whole world is mine. I don't need you to feed me. I don't need bull's flesh and blood of goats. Every animal in the forest is mine. I can go take it if I want. What do you think I need these for? So says King David, no, what you need to do is you need to give thanks to God and pay vows to him. As promises. Call upon him in your time of trouble, and then he will answer you and honor. So again, it seems to be taking the focus completely off the sacrifices, saying, you know, you're missing the point here. I don't need your bulls and your goats. I need you to offer thanks to me. I need you to pledge to me. I need you to know that you should call upon me and pray to me. So what's going on here? Like I said, I mean, this almost sounds like something to be written by, you know, an animal rights group saying, you know, sacrificing animals is wrong. You know, it's not the way to connect to God. But the Torah tells us to do it.
People need something tangible to show that they are paying respect and thanks to God. And they needed something tangible to do that. And sacrifice was one way that they could say, well, look, I'm giving the sacrifice. This is how I'm showing respect.
Yes. So, correct. It doesn't say not sacrifice. It says not do it for the wrong reasons. I mean, it gets more serious. You're taking the life of an animal. You better be sure you're doing it for the right reasons, in the service of God. I mean, it calls to mind the idea that sometimes you'll come across a person who says, you say to them, would you like, would you like to be called up to the Torah? And they say, oh, I don't believe in God, Rabbi. I think it would be disrespectful. Or, would you like to hear the shofar? Oh, no, I'd be doing it for the wrong reasons. And we usually say to people, it doesn't matter what your reason is. Judaism is a religion of action. This gives you all the ammunition you would need to say, well, I know that I'm supposed to bring a korban, but I've learned all the prophets, and there's quite scathing of people who do it with the wrong intentions. And I'm not sure I'd have the right intentions. So I think I'm just going to give it a miss. That would be an understandable reaction. So it seems rather strange. There's a lot of this about. There's more coming. Here, let's see what Jeremiah has to say. Oh, no, sorry, another one. Right, we say this every day. Okay, who'd like to read number 5? Who hasn't read yet?
I'll read this if you like.
Yeah.
O Lord, open my lips and let my mouth declare your praise. You do not want me to bring sacrifices. You do not desire burnt offerings. True sacrifice to God is a contrite spirit. God, you will not despise a contrite and crushed heart.
Right. We've had this before, right? So the true sacrifice is not the burnt offering. It's a contrite spirit and it's a crushed heart. It's basically a person. It's contrition. It's humility. It's being broken because of one's realizing of one's failings, right? So this is we say every day, Hashem sefasai tiftach fi yagid tilasecha. O Lord, open my lips, let my mouth declare your praise. These two verses are the continuation of that in the psalm. You, Hashem, don't want my sacrifices, says King David again. You don't want my burnt offerings. What do you mean? God commanded you to bring them. True sacrifice, a contrite spirit and a contrite and crushed heart. It does kind of lead you to, people sometimes say, oh, davening, so many words in Hebrew, we get so caught up in struggling to read the Hebrew that we don't actually worry about the meaning or the impact. It was almost the same thing. It's saying you get so caught up in the physical burning of the sacrifices, you're actually missing the whole point of them. Seems to be an ongoing concern here throughout the prophets. I'm not even talking about our generation, we're talking about a much more spiritual generation. So what is the point of all of this?
To give up part of your wealth, part of what you own, that you're willing to do so to praise God.
Right.
It means more to you to praise God than to have this wealth, this animal that will you can make use of.
Yeah. It seems also that
Rabbi, was it also a way of sort of weaning them away from the worship of idols, because sacrifice was very much a thing at the time in idol worship? Was it a way of saying, well, don't worship the idols, but you can give your sacrifices to God instead?
possibly, but let's see, because there's so much more fundamental going on with the whole. Now,
also in those times they did child sacrifices. So maybe this would say, well,
let's see.
Sacrifice a child, let's sacrifice an animal instead.
Let's see. Let's have a look at a bit more criticism, and then let's look at it from the other side. So here we've got good old Jeremiah, prophet of doom. Right? What's he got to say about it? Deborah, Beryl, would you like to read?
Yes, I'll read.
Or Lisa, sorry, forgot you there.
For when I freed your fathers from the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice. But this is what I commanded them: do my bidding, that I may be your God and you may be my people. Walk only in the way that I enjoin upon you, that it may go well with you.
But Rabbi, that first sentence, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings or sacrifice.
I know what
He
you're going to say.
did.
Yes, the Pesach offering and others, but that wasn't the centrality, right? All the commandments and the daily offerings comes later. So it says Jeremiah, that wasn't what it was all about. It was all about doing what God tells you, walking the way that he tells you, which is often an allusion to one's ethical behavior and character, that things should go well for you. Okay, we've got two more quite critical views, and then we'll have a look up from the other side. It's Isaiah. Let's have a look at Isaiah. Lisa, are you there? Would you like to read? Not sure if she's there.
It's Sarah, I think you're thinking of. No, I can't. If I could read, I don't like reading, and I
Okay, no problem.
Screen. It's
Oh, sorry.
telephone
Right,
only.
right. Okay, okay. So we're back to the beginning. Who hasn't read yet?
I only read a little bit.
Right, go for it.
I only read a little bit, so I'll read it.
Yeah.
What need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats, that you come to appear before me. Who asked that of you? Trample my courts so more. Bring oblations in futile. Incense is offense to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming of solemn assemblies with iniquity, I cannot abide. Finding it difficult to read.
Yeah. Oblation seems to mean like ablutions, which is offerings to God. Okay, so again, it's God saying, I don't know, your Shabbos, your Yom Tov, I don't want it. Right? It's almost the equivalent of standing up in shul and saying, anyone who's not going to behave with proper decorum, get lost and don't ever come back, basically. Strange. Now, in case you think that all of this is a sort of, a vegan charter and all that kind of thing, let's see what else Jeremiah has to say. Because you might think from all these prophetic sources that they're very down on the idea of sacrifices and we should just cancel the whole thing and close down the temple. That's not their issue. Their issue is not the concept.
It's sarcasm, isn't it? It's sarcasm, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit sarcastic, definitely. Right? There's an element of sort of irony. Don't tell Jeremy Corbyn. Irony and sarcasm there. But also their issue is with the mechanism, how people are applying it. Now, you can turn around and say, it's all very well saying the prophets are not against Corbyn, not. They're against the fact that people are missing the point. But then at what point do you change things? Last year, as a result of necessity, we shortened the weekday slichot quite substantially, and quite honestly, I personally found it quite refreshing. It was a lot easier to do without having to rush to fit all the words in. We shortened our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services, which actually for a lot of people said that the decorum was better, that not asking people to sit for 4 hours because people were more spread out. So actually, in many ways, it was a lot better sometimes, because maybe we've gone on for so many years just doing things the way we do them that we've never rethought it. And suddenly we had to rethink it. Actually, it wasn't so bad. The quorum was better. People knew that the service was going to be an hour and a half. It would include the shofar and the laning and davening, and that was fine. Is that such a terrible thing? So it's all very well saying, as we can, if you look carefully, the prophets are not criticizing. They're not saying God doesn't want sacrifices. He says, I don't want your sacrifices, is in the way you're doing them, right? So, but how long can we say, imagine talking, people increasingly illiterate in Hebrew. Imagine a scenario where we didn't have an explanatory service or anything of that nature, and your options were to come Shul Yom Kippur and sit there for 25 hours, basically, or do nothing. People start saying, I find it too hard to follow all this Hebrew. And you see, and they say, you see, God doesn't like the way that we're doing the prayers. And we say, well, it's not that God doesn't like, it's just us at fault. But fundamentally, the prayers are correct, and they've worked for centuries. And how long does it take before we say, actually, it's time to offer an explanatory service? Time to offer an alternative for those that need it. Wouldn't that be a Monday response? We say we're not negating the traditional approach, but maybe it's time to rethink it. It seems what the prophets are saying. They're not saying that you shouldn't do sacrifices necessarily. They're saying that the way that people are doing it isn't working for them. It's an interesting one. So what was their equivalent to the clergy service in those days? I'm not sure. But anyway, let's see. Maybe they had a marquee in the temple with Michael Rainsbury. Okay, maybe they will in the future. Okay, let's see. Now, in case you think it is a sort of vegan's charter and sort of, save the animals and all that, let's just see what the same Jeremiah has to say elsewhere. You probably might recognize this. No, I don't think. I was going to say I think it's from the Davening or Shoni Kippur, but it's not. It's very similar. Okay, we've got a lot of sources today, by the way, so lots of reading. Iris, I think back to you. Would you like to read?
Okay. And people shall come from the towns of Judah, and from the environs of Jerusalem, and from the land of Benjamin, and from the Shephelah, and from the hill country, and from the Negev, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, meal offerings and frankincense, and bringing offerings of thanksgiving to the house of the Lord.
Thank you. And do you want to just do the next one as well, which you'll all recognize from the Slichot and from the Rosh Hashanah prayers?
Okay. I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples.
So, which is it? Right, that's right before Shema Kalenu. So, Jeremiah, Isaiah speaking about we'll bring the sacrifice, we'll all come to Jerusalem, we'll come to the house of God, and then elsewhere saying he despises our sacrifices. So clearly their issue isn't with the sacrifices per se. The issue is
With intention.
I don't remember why the second temple was destroyed. Classic reason we're
They
given.
argued.
Right, baseless
There's like-
hatred, right?
Yeah.
If you remember the story from Tisha B'Av, Kamta and Balkamta, which the Gemara brings, says that the reason for the destruction of the temple was somebody didn't get an invite to a party, right? Baseless hatred. So, but they're bringing on the sacrifices, right? Or the modern day equivalent would be to say to somebody, you're buying food that has more kosher seals on it than there's even space on the packet for. It's got a kosher seal from here and a kosher seal from there. It's super duper extra special ultra kosher and it costs more money, and you wouldn't, God forbid, have anything else in your house, or God forbid you should drink the whiskey that's made in the sherry cask, even though some people allow it and some people don't. When it comes out, you're really, really, really careful. And when it comes to Pesach, you spend, £50 per box on your matzah, right? You're really good at that. When it comes to Shabbos, you have, I don't know, solid gold candlesticks. But when it comes to your business dealings, you're very quick to, to cut corners. Or when it comes to giving charity or somebody in need, you're very quick to ignore somebody. When it comes to hurting someone's feelings, you're very quick to do it. We know from the story of Kamsa and Bar-Kamsa and from what we are told from the prophets at the time that society was not ideal. So people may have been going through the motions of the sacrifices, but it wasn't. In other ways, they weren't doing it right. How can you serve God and at the same time not serve society, as it were? How can you think that it's okay as long as you sacrifice to God and you're in his good books, it doesn't matter what you give back to the rest of society? All these prophets lived through probably turbulent times, oftentimes when there was bribery and corruption, there was a lack of justice. We spoke about it before. We recently had a show, we looked at all the sources for social justice, right? These same prophets that were saying how you must look out for the weak and the poor. There were many times there was abuse of power, many Kohen Gadolim, even the high priests, certainly the kings we know from Tanakh, right? There were often problems in society. So these prophets are living in a time, it'd be the equivalent of somebody saying, Mr. So-and-so goes to shul every week and shockles 100 miles an hour, and then he goes home and abuses his kids. Or, and then he goes to work and he's a slum landlord. But you see him in shul, such a mensch davening. And when he leads the davening, such a beautiful, right? It's the equivalent of that. Or it's all for charity, right? Jimmy Savile. But he did so much for charity. Actually, that's even worse because there he was giving back. That's a bad example. But, it's when people will focus on one area, right? How often will we do that? We'll say, well, You'll have, when they had the scandal in Monsey with the meat a few years ago, so people can't understand how this chap could be saying non-kosher meat. He was in shul 3 times a day, went to shiurim, he was okay. Unfortunately, it can happen. And this is what the prophets are concerned about. They're not saying you shouldn't bring sacrifices. They're saying there'll come a time they do bring sacrifices, and it'll be beautiful. But you should know there's not a substitute for what the sacrifice is supposed to be doing, which is making you realize how grateful you are to God that you haven't had to sacrifice yourself. And but for the grace of God, there go I. And this animal is in lieu of, I really deserve to be burnt on the altar because I'm not perfect. But in God's grace, he gives me a second chance. And if you can basically bring the sacrifices and then go back to life as it was and carry on, say the prophets, I don't need that. Right? That's not what it's about. Right? We say the same, by the way, about davening. A person can go and daven and come out and not be transformed in some way, or changed, or more sensitive, or a better person, then they've probably not done it right. We know that if you wrong another person, you're wronging God, because man is created in the image of God. And what's the very first thing that God says about Avraham? He doesn't say he's going to bring korbanot sacrifices. What does he say about him? Looking on my screen, I've got Pam and Julian next down. I don't know how it decides the order, but would one of you like to read number 10?
Okay. Sure. Yeah, sure. For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord, by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him.
Right, remember we had this before. The fact that he's going to teach his children, teach them what? Doesn't say teach them how to spill blood and guts. Doesn't say teach them how to daven or build shuls or even mikvahs or keep kosher or keep Shabbos. What does it say? Doing what is just and right. Right, we had this earlier, if you recall. It's a bit of a theme. Right, we had in the Tillim. He said, I don't want your sacrifice. I want you to do what's right and just. Right? Somebody says, I don't need your presence. I just need you right now to ... It doesn't mean they don't want your presence. It means there's something more important to me right now. So what's the way of the Lord is to be just and righteous towards fellow human beings. Right? And in fact, what did Avram do? We know he petitioned God for the people of Sodom, even though they were wicked and sinners. Okay, here's another interesting thought. The book of Vayikra, which is all about sacrifice, we find various other laws as well. Here's a couple from, I think, Kedoshim. We're back to, well, who just read? Pam.
Yeah.
Julian, would you like to read?
Yeah. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord. I, the Lord, am your God.
Right. Anyone remember why it says I am the Lord afterwards with these? It says it also when it says you should rise before an elderly person. And remember why we sometimes find that particular mitzvah? Often bein adam lechaveru, interpersonal mitzvot, and it will say afterwards, I am the Lord your God. Anyone remember the explanation of this? No? So I think Rashi says in a few different places, it's coming to remind you that even if no one else knows, Hashem will know. So for example, love your neighbors yourself. Sometimes it will be obvious that you're not doing it, right? Somebody in need and you completely ignore them. But oftentimes it won't be so obvious and it'll be subjective. Right? In the classic example, when it says that you should rise before an elderly person, and I am the Lord your God. Why? Because you're on the tube and you're half asleep, and somebody gets on who clearly needs your seat, and you pretend to be asleep. You close your eyes a bit more. And then someone says, "Oh, are you going to get up for them?" "Oh, I didn't see them. I'm so sorry." "Yes, of course I will." Now I don't know if you're telling the truth or not, but God will know. So it's not about whether doing the right thing in optics, the eyes of other people. It's about Hashem's going to know the truth. Anyway, so in Vayikra, which is primarily about sacrifices, we have these laws of not taking vengeance and not bearing grudges. Love your neighbors yourself, right? The whole Torah on one foot, as Hillel famously said. How to treat foreigners. Basically, how to have a just and kind society. What's that got to do with sacrifice? So if you're bringing all those sacrifices, which are supposed to humble you and make you, crushed of heart, but then you're mistreating people and you're bearing grudges and you're taking vengeance and you don't love your neighbor and you're mistreating the foreigners or the strangers in your land, you have no respect for resident aliens, you treat them, the citizens, badly, then you've missed the point. And that's why they're put together in the same book. And Amos and Hosea and Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the people we've just quoted, all lived through turbulent times, often societies which were far from perfect. The temple offerings were good. They got that right. I guess the Kohanim were well trained. And people knew that you have to come, whatever, every day or whenever it is, 3 times a year, whatever. They were very good at that. I just like people are very good at saying, I know I need to go to shul more or whatever. But once you get there, what are you doing? And more than that, what effect is it having on you? So the prophet saw that people were missing the point. Even with the greatness of the temple, even in due course, people were missing the point. Now, somebody, I think Brenda mentioned that, of course, ancient societies did bring sacrifices. Almost everyone did. They'd have temples and priests and animal sacrifices. And in that sense, presumably at the time, ancient Israel would have seemed very similar to those cultures. There was a fundamental difference, though. The difference was that they did it to appease their gods or to placate their gods. In Judaism, that wasn't the idea. We're not bribing God. The idea was to bring home to us, first of all, our animal instincts and our need to tame them, like we learned in Tanya. And secondly, that our thankfulness to God, that but for the grace of God, there go I. Really, I need to check the animal within me. I need to control myself. I need to be a better person. So whether you think that's a good idea or not, put that to one side. If you think that by bringing your korbanot, you've ticked all the boxes you need to as a person, then you completely miss the point. You've bought into the ancient pagan religions where all you have to do is appease the gods and everything's okay. Judaism says, no, that's not how it works. Serving God is to serve society and humanity. Let's see. What does God require of us, according to Micha? With what, Jeff or Brenda, would you like to read?
Which one?
Here. You got it?
What-
Or is it not?
yeah. With,
Number 12?
with
Yeah.
what shall I approach the Lord? Is that the one? Yeah.
Yeah.
With what shall I approach the Lord? Do homage to God on high. Shall I approach him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Would the Lord be pleased with the thousands of rams, with a myriad of streams of oil? Shall I found my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for my sins? He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to do love goodness and to walk modesty with your law, with your God.
Here you go. God says, I want justice and goodness and modesty. Now, you say, but there's loads of commandments about sacrifice. So clearly in the pecking order, we should understand that the sacrifice only works when it's in the context of all these other things that a person says, I am just and I love goodness. I walk modesty with God. And how do I serve God? One of the ways I serve God is with animal sacrifices, which brings home to me my humility and my mortality and makes me want to be a better person and sacrifice the animal within me, as opposed to, oh, look at me, I got the biggest, fattest sacrifice because I got a pay rise this year because, I'm an important person or whatever it is, right? It's interesting also, I noticed there, the fruit of my body. I thought that was probably quite a little refutation of Christianity there as well, about the idea of sacrifice of the body. Jeremiah again. This is Jeremiah speaking about King Hosea. Josiah. I don't remember his Hebrew name.
I'll do it.
Yoshia, right? Off you go.
Right. He upheld the rights of the poor and needy, then all was well. That is truly heeding me, declares the Lord.
So that's actually not such a good translation. A better translation was Dan din ani. He judges, helps the poor, basically, the everyone and the needy. As toiv, hello, which is therefore good. Hello, he is this not hadas, the knowledge of OC God. declares the Lord. In other words, what is to know God? It's not to bring animal sacrifices, he says. It's to uphold the rights of the poor and the needy, and then things will be good, says God. And finally, I think, Jeremiah again, only in this should one glory, in his earnest devotion to me. For I, the Lord, act with kindness, justice, and equity in the world. In these do I delight, declares the Lord. So which is it? Are we supposed to bring sacrifices, or are we supposed to be good people? So the prophets seem to have signaled a little danger that the sacrifices can bring a complacency. Right? Again, leaving aside all the blood and guts, but the concept can bring it's a very awesome experience. It's a very physical, visual experience, and it can bring a complacency that you think that what is required of me is to bring animals to God, rather than what is required of me is to be act with kindness and justice and equity, to be a good person, to look out for those who are trampled upon. And as part of my service of that, and to bring home to me the futility of life and my animal nature, which needs taming, we shecht and we eat and we basically burn parts of animals, which sounds horrible. They're never burnt alive. It's always after they were killed, on the altar.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yes, except you're a Cohen, so you're going to have to do all this stuff one day.
Oh, right. What happened to the sacrifices, though, when they were?
So certain parts,
were they eaten or what?
Oh, thank you, Dave. Certain parts were eaten, certain parts were burnt. I think pretty much everything got used for something, and certain parts were cleaned out at the end of the day. Heard a nice sermon the other week. So Rabbi Bramman and I went to his shul a couple of weeks ago when we were closed, and he spoke about the Mishkan. He said, it's very strange. We have this beautiful, and it was his mother's yacht actually, so he related it to her, and some of you will have known her. Sounds like she was a real balabos in terms of the house was always completely pristine despite having lots of kids running around. So he spoke about the Mishkan, that the Torah describes in great detail how we build this beautiful edifice with gold and silver and all the way we dye the skins in a certain color. And with all of that, what do we then do? We go and basically splash blood and guts all over the place. And then at the end of the day, the Kohanim come. One of the jobs the Kohanim had was to clean up, right? You burn or clean off anything that's remaining until it's ready for the next morning. You go and do it again. So it seems like a rather strange process. But he said, basically, this is what life is all about. Life is not about, perfect, pristine, clean, flawless things. Life is about basically, in our day-to-day lives, we make a mess of things, and as we go about our service of God and our mitzvahs, it's not perfect. It's not clean and, sterile. On the contrary, we often make a mess of things. We make a mess of relationships, make a mess of the world. And hopefully by the end of the day, we somehow clean up the mess. And then we start again the next day. The world is not perfect. So in answer to Mark's question, they did get cleaned up, but I'm sure it wasn't. One of the things it says in the Pirkei Avos is one of the miracles of the temple is that a pregnant woman never had a miscarriage from this pungent smell of the offerings. So clearly they didn't smell that nice. If anyone's ever been to an abattoir, it does not smell nice at all. Even butchers, look, it's not so bad now. I remember as a kid, we were all vegetarians and there was no kosher butcher where I grew up. They got chicken delivered, but you would walk through the market and the butchers stank. It was disgusting. I don't think it, probably because we thought it's non-kosher, but kosher meat also stinks. It's a horrible thing, basically. So, so maybe it's something to be mindful of in a time where we don't have sacrifices. That the prophets warned us that it's possible to get off your game, because what will happen is that you'll have these ritualized sacrifices, and instead of getting the deeper meaning and taking the message, you'll just say, I've done it, I've ticked the box, right? The equivalent today would be somebody saying, I don't know, you go to shul and you daven Yom Kippur, but you just read the words without any thought or any care, then you go home again, as opposed to trying to understand what we're saying, trying to connect, which is often hard. There's a lot of Hebrew in there. So this last quote was from Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed. It's clearly what he's saying as a guide for life. What should one take delight in and glory? Well, basically one's values, essentially. What's the danger of sacrifices then, according to the prophets? The danger is that you then compartmentalize. You have the temple and you have everything else. So when it comes to the temple and serving God, I'll bring the best and the finest and I'll do all the right things. When it comes to other people, I'll just act dismissively, which is what often happened in those societies. They were unjust societies, they were corrupt societies. So halachically, that's true. There are halachas with sacrifices, and there are different halachas when it comes to your relationships with people. But in terms of your mind, your worldview, your theology, how you see the world, and certainly your relationship to Hashem, there should be no difference. Should be no difference whether you bring an animal sacrifice in the temple, or whether you're giving charity, or whether you're helping an old lady cross the road, or giving up your seat for somebody, or respecting your elders, or not speaking lashon hara and hurting people's feelings, or not ripping people off in your business dealings, etc., etc., etc. All these things come under the same banner. Prophets warned us against that person, the guy that goes to shul in a fancy suit and gives loads of nice donations and davens beautifully, but then the rest of the week is a scoundrel. And it's come up before that it says, to be a witness on a ketubah or for any legal purpose, you have to be a shomer Shabbat. So that doesn't mean you have to be shomer Shabbat, but you're in prison for fraud. Shomer Shabbat was seen as an indication that you take your religious beliefs seriously, and also because Shabbos represents creation. So by keeping Shabbos, you're showing you recognize God has created the world. But if you're shomer Shabbos, but you abuse your spouse, and like I said, if you're shomer Shabbos but you're in prison for fraud, then you're clearly not a fine, upstanding person. There's once a story, I've told it before, I don't know if it was true, if it was like an urban myth, about these, it's very sad actually. I'm sure Reb Levi Yitzchak Bedichah would have something nice to say about it, about these from drug dealers in Brooklyn that were quite happy to basically, have a part in probably causing pain, if not death, to many teenagers. But if you call them Friday afternoon, they'd say you have to come and get it for Shabbos, otherwise we're closed for 25 hours, right? So or you couldn't be, I don't know, if you had like an Orthodox brothel that closed for Shabbos, it's bizarre, right? So, but people do it. We miss the point. We often hear people say, "How can people be so careful about ... and yet they don't care about this? How can somebody be so careful about kashrut and yet they're a slum landlord?" Or they rip people off, that they're selling fraudulent, whatever, So it's the same dissonance, really. It's the same thing the prophets warned us about. They're not saying don't bring those sacrifices, but they're saying, remember, sacrifices are your service of God. And if that doesn't humble you and make you realize and give you a bigger picture of things, if you can just say, I did a great sacrifice today, and now you go home and you're the same person you were, and in other areas of your life you're lacking, God says, I don't want those sacrifices. I don't want your empty offerings if you're basically not going to have the values that should go with it. I suppose possibly a linked point might be to say that an animal sacrifice is not something to be taken lightly. The Torah does tell us to sacrifice animals, but here's a question. What if I do an animal sacrifice and I have no intention behind it? And it's just a waste of a life of an animal. I've probably got a lot to answer for. Because in the heavenly court one day, they're going to say to me, you took that beautiful cow and it got shechted. Okay, you ate some of it, but still, some of it went to waste. And all because you have such a big ego that you think you're such a big so-and-so. And meanwhile, it didn't change you. It didn't improve you. You just thought that you bribed God with it, like all the other ancient cultures that would appease their gods. So I think that's what the prophets were warning us about. So everything is beshert, and we don't have sacrifices today. Some people like that, some people don't. They say that, of course, the sacrifices were replaced with our daily prayers, where we pour ourselves out before God. Maybe some of the same ideas apply. If I can go to shul and pour out my heart and beat my chest so hard and then go home and be, miserable and rude to my family, then I've missed the point somewhere. So maybe these sentiments are not unchanged. They just apply to different things. But to be clear, the prophets are not saying... One second. The prophets are not anti-sacrifices. They are sounding a note of caution. And like I said earlier, the one concern you can have with this, you could say, according to this, if you start measuring the yard, are we doing mitzvahs properly? Are we doing them the right kavanah? If not, we shouldn't do them. I'll give you an example. There is a mitzvah to tell people off, right? There's a mitzvah to rebuke your neighbor. So I would put it to you that would be a very good example of a mitzvah that don't do it unless you're going to do it right. And right means that your words are going to be taken in the right manner. So maybe it does apply to other mitzvot. Yes, Mark.
Yes. When did the sacrifices stop? And who decided it to stop the sacrifices?
Destruction of the temple, fact of life, dispersal. And then we run into issues like in the fullness of time, everybody becomes tamei and they need ritual purification. But initially, it's simply the destruction of the temple. I think even before that, didn't the Greeks mess it up at Hanukkah? There were periods of time where the temple was out of commission through idols that were brought in and things like that, but presumably with the destruction of the second temple. Because prior to the temple, you had what were called bamot, which is like the word bima. So people could bring offerings outside of the temple. The Mishkan was outside the temple. The Pesach offering was brought outside the temple. The whole business with the prophets of Baal and Elijah took place outside of the temple. Once the temple was in place, that became the focal point, and you could no longer bring an offering outside of the temple. Once the temple's destroyed, basically the whole thing falls apart.
Didn't that lead to formal prayer instead of the sacrifices?
Yes, and prayer. It's not entirely clear what role shuls had. There clearly were shuls. I don't know if they were called a shul, Beis HaKnesses. Not everyone went to Jerusalem all the time. So what did you do if you were living outside of Jerusalem? And even if you lived in Jerusalem, not everyone went to. Does everyone go to the Kotel every week in Jerusalem? No, you go sometimes. Some people do, some people don't. So the whole question of even in temple times, it seems that they had localized prayer, but it was presumably far less dominant because the temple service dominated. It's not entirely clear. Prayer as we know it, the formal structure is, we know from the men of the second of the Great Assembly, which is around towards the end of the Second Temple times. It's that transition period. I mentioned before that I once went to a seminar with a chap called Dr. Russell Hook, who's a change management expert, basically at how getting organizations to strategize and shift their whole thinking. And he's also a religious Christian. And he said, and it didn't hit me until he said it, and the same is true, by the way, for the pandemic. He said that the greatest ever change, what do they call it, paradigm shift in history, and successful one, is the destruction of the temple. Because with the destruction of the temple, you would assume that Judaism would have fallen apart without the temple. And what happened? We rallied around. Our rabbi said, okay, so you'll have a shul, that will be your miniature sanctuary, and your home will be your sanctuary, like the Torah says. And Judaism will continue outside of the temple. And we evolved structures. And we're so successful that people tell you it's more important to go to shul, even if it means breaking Shabbat to get there, because that's how successful that paradigm shift was. Right? And you talk about the temple now, it's the old days. Oh gosh, animal sacrifices. Oh, don't like the sound of that. And we've shifted paradigm again. We're doing things at home. We're doing things online. We always adapt. We manage. If somebody would come to a large group of worshippers of a particular faith and say, you're no longer going to have your mosques or your churches, you're going to have to completely rethink your whole system. People say, well, we can't do that. It's so central. And yet we did it in Judaism 2,000 years ago. And we've had to do it again the past year. It's what we always do. So with the destruction of the temple, the leadership at the time had all kinds of challenges, and they rose to that challenge. They created a system where local community and local shuls and gatherings replaced that centrality, and it's been successful. And it's hugely successful. So it's a strange one. And many of the 630 mitzvot involve korbanot. There's no question about it. I must get around to reading Rabbi Sachs's essay, because Fallen, he answers all these questions. But the ancient prophets had, you could see maybe a vegan, or I don't know, nothing against vegans, somebody who's, I'm assuming vegans generally are pro-animal rights, but let's say, whatever, maybe not. Somebody who's very pro-animal rights coming along and saying, I could understand if, the sacrifices were, occasional, and maybe they were very carefully regulated, and there were, UN, what do they call it, observers there, and, I don't know, whatever. But, when you're doing it all day and every day and everyone's just coming along and no one has any respect. I'll give you a parallel. Anyone been to Kapparot recently? Kapparas, or ever been in your lifetime? So I must admit, we stopped going a few years ago. We used to go from Liverpool to Manchester. Kapparas, where you swing the chicken, shlog kapparas, yeah? So we used to go, and where you go where it's done well, you don't swing a chicken by its legs around your head. Take a chicken very gently, you hold it. Yes, you do. You move it around. You don't swing it. You do it gently, and you say Zeh Kapparasi with great sensitivity to the animal and its feelings. And yes, it gets shechted afterwards. It gets shechted in a kosher way, but it's the image of someone swinging a chicken around the head. And animal rights violations is wrong. And needless to say, maybe that'd be a good modern day example. It's a custom which many have, which is a bit weird for many people, but if done right, it can be done sensitively and with regard to animal rights. Now, if it's not done right, then not only have you missed the whole point, and again, what's the point of kaparas? You're saying, really, I probably deserve to die, God. I've done so much terrible things this year, but you in your infinite mercy allow me to live. And I offer this chicken as an atonement in my place. And by the way, the kaparas, the money is always supposed to go to the poor. Part of the whole idea is, all the chickens, after they're shechted, go to the poor. So not only could that be wrong if you don't do it right, as it were, but it could be counterproductive because you could be violating some Torah commandments. The Torah says that you're not allowed to be cruel to animals. So if you're doing that custom and you're not treating that chicken with the utmost respect, then not only have you missed the point, but actually you might be doing a Vayikra as well. So you can see the danger of, maybe that's the closest you can come, modern day equivalent, animal sacrifices. Some people say Kabbalistically applies to eating meat, by the way. In Kabbalah, we talk about animal, vegetable. Oh no, we don't. We talk about, yes, domain, which is basically mineral, tzomeach, which is vegetable, chai, which is animal, and I can't think of the other one. Human beings, medaber, that speak, human beings. And in Kabbalah, basically, the higher up the food chain you eat, the more elevated that food becomes if you do it right. So if you eat, whatever, I don't know, something that's what's the most basic thing? I don't know, grain and not grain, I don't know, corn or something. Okay, you're eating corn. If you eat an animal that was once living and breathing, so if you do it for the right reasons and you do it, it's shechted and it's kosher, and you do it for Shabbos Yom Tov, and you do it in a refined way, and you eat with a knife and fork, you don't stuff it in your mouth, and you're kind to the animals before they're killed and whatever, then you can elevate that animal in the service of God. It's the closest you can come to a korban is your chicken soup Friday night, if it's done with the right intentions. If you do it with the wrong intentions, if you picture a person who's a glutton, or who's eating disgustingly, the most disgusting picture you can probably have in your head is someone eating like chicken off the bone, and like an animal or something like that. That same person eating cereal and milk, or it's also disgusting. It's something particularly disgusting when it's meat and you're doing it in a very animalistic way. So the higher up the food chain, the more potential there is for, unfortunately, for it to reflect one's own animalistic behavior. But on the other hand, according to Kabbalah, if you do it right, you're elevating it. So we should be very mindful actually about eating meat. We should be very careful. Makes sense. We should do it right and for the right reasons. It's a very base instinct. Forget all the health issues and whatever. So that's what the sages seem to be saying about the korbanot as well. Not that you shouldn't do them, but you should be very, very mindful of your state of mind. Right? We say the same thing about davening nowadays, definitely. But it's one thing to get to shul and turn up for service or whatever, open your siddur at home. It's quite another thing to get the full value out of it and to do it right. There we go. I'm going to stop sharing. I think that's the last slide. Oh no, yeah, we did that. Right, yeah. So like many things in Judaism, we've got a contradiction. We've got many places where the prophets are very critical. We've got other places, and they say the main thing is justice and righteousness, and other places where they say there'll come a time that you bring your sacrifices. So clearly, they want us to do it right, with the right kavanah and the right thinking behind it. Very important, particularly something so monumental. Otherwise, you've got no business harming animals if you've got the wrong mindset, shall we say. Right. That's enough from me. Anyone else got anything to share?
Are we going to have a share about Pesach?
Yeah, we'll do next week we should do Pesach. Wait, next week's Pesach, isn't it? Oh yeah, we should have done Pesach today, actually.
No, it's not.
Yeah, no, next Monday. Right, Blima and I were talking about trying to do like 1 or 2 evening shurim about Pesach as well. We haven't got our head around it yet. We'll definitely do something. Probably at some point this week. I'll share it. But as you now know, I know it's not the same as doing things live, but the beauty of all this is you can record it and have it later. So even if the time doesn't work for someone, then they can watch it later. Yes, we will do next Monday morning. We'll do something to